The room is quiet now. The world outside has dimmed into shadow, leaving only the hum of distant life and the slow rhythm of your own breath. Perhaps your day has been full. Perhaps your mind still echoes with unfinished thoughts, with lists and worries, with movement that hasn't yet come to rest. But here, in this space, none of that is needed. You've arrived at a place where we let history unfold like a soft tide, and I'm truly glad you're here. Before we begin tonight's journey, I'd like to take a gentle moment to say thank you. If these stories bring you comfort, if they accompany you in the quiet hours, or help you ease into rest, it means the world to me if you would consider subscribing to the channel. A like, a comment, a share, they may seem small, but they help this calm, quiet little world grow. They allow these stories to reach more people, to bring stillness where it's needed. And for that, I'm deeply grateful. Tonight, I invite you to settle in a little deeper, to pull the blankets closer, let your shoulders fall, let your eyes grow heavy if they wish. There is no rush here, no sharp turns. Just a soft voice, a steady rhythm, and a long journey through time. We won't rush to conclusions or hurry toward endings. We'll walk slowly, like through a quiet corridor lit by candlelight, pausing often, listening more than we speak. And tonight, we'll begin a story you may think you already know. The name Napoleon Bonaparte echoes loudly in the chambers of history. For some, it means power, strategy, revolution. For others, it brings images of war, of ambition, of empires built and broken. But here, we tell stories differently. Here, we listen to the silences, the footsteps no one heard, the breath between decisions, the longing behind the eyes of someone who changed the world and was changed by it in return. This is not the tale of an emperor standing on a battlefield, nor of a legend carved in marble. It is the story of a boy from a distant island who spoke French with an accent and carried maps like treasures. It is the story of someone restless, curious, fragile, stubborn, a dreamer who became a conqueror who became a prisoner, and in the end, a man who watched the world move on without him. Napoleon was born not in Paris or Rome, but in Corsica, a rocky, stubborn island surrounded by a restless sea. He was not noble by the standards of the old world. His family was minor, proud, poor in the ways that mattered to kings. But in his mind, in the hunger behind his eyes, there was something else. A fire, a certainty, a belief that he would not stay forgotten. He read the ancient histories under flickering light, tracing the footsteps of Caesar, of Alexander. He memorized maps instead of playing with other children. He imagined storms, wars, empires. While others dreamed of marriage or land or stability, Napoleon dreamed of movement, of rising above, of bending the world to his will. But even ambition has quiet nights. Even conquerors feel the cold. And that's where we'll spend most of our time, not in the thunder of battles, but in the stillness of the moments between. When he stood alone at a window, wondering if the path he'd chosen could still be changed. When he held letters in his hand, unsure if they would be read or burned. When he listened, not to crowds, but to silence. We'll follow him across mountains and deserts, through applause and exile, through courts and prison walls. But we'll walk softly. We'll pause often. We'll listen closely. Because this is not just the story of rise and fall. It is the story of longing, of hunger, of a soul who wanted to be more than history allowed, and of what it cost him. You may admire him. You may despise him. Or perhaps, like many who've tried to understand him, you'll feel both at once. That's all right. That's what history is made of, not clear lines, but complexity. Not answers, but questions that echo through time. And so, tonight, I'll take you there, to the hills of Corsica, where a boy once stood with salt on his skin and wind in his hair, to the candlelit halls of the École Militaire, where he studied alone while others slept, to the tent before battle, where he couldn't rest, to the quiet room on St. Helena, where the world had finally gone silent around him. Let yourself rest now. Let your breath grow slower, softer. Let your thoughts float gently away. There's nothing you need to hold on to. I'll be here. I'll carry the story for you. And if sleep comes, let it. The story will wait. You don't need to reach the end to feel its weight. You only need to let it settle around you, like dusk. Now, take a slow breath in. And as you exhale, we'll begin. He was born into the sound of the sea, where waves broke softly against the Corsican shore, where the salt wind threaded through olive branches and rattled the shutters of small stone homes, where narrow alleys held the scent of bread and ash and the hushed quarrels of neighbors, where voices rose in Corsican dialect, proud and musical, and where the afternoon stretched long and golden beneath the gaze of distant mountains. In this rugged and complicated land, where every hill seemed to carry both memory and defiance, the boy who would one day be Napoleon Bonaparte arrived into the world, not as emperor or general, but as a quiet child with watchful eyes and a name no one outside the island had yet learned to pronounce. Corsica was not France, not really, not yet in the hearts of its people, and certainly not in the heart of his mother, Letizia, who carried pride and anger in equal measure, as she raised her children in the shadow of changing regimes and foreign rule. The Bonapartes were noble only in title, clinging to a lineage that gave them little in the way of wealth or protection, but much in the form of expectation. In their modest home above the city of Ajaccio, where the scent of roasting chestnuts mingled with the faint tang of seaweed, young Napoleon listened to arguments about loyalty and independence, about France and Genoa, and the spirit of Paolo, the Corsican hero his father once followed and his mother never quite forgave for surrendering. The boy said little in those early years, and when he did, his voice carried the rolling cadence of his island, that blend of French spoken with Corsican flavor, tinged with Italian, and something, older still, something wild and untamed like the terrain itself. His words were not yet weapons, but they were different, and difference, he would learn quickly, could be both a shield and a mark. He wandered often alone, exploring the stony paths that climbed through thickets of myrtle and wild rosemary, watching the way goats balanced on crags, how storms built slowly over the sea, then broke without mercy. He observed the world the way a tactician watches a battlefield, quietly, without blinking. There was fire in him, even then, but it burned low and inward, not like a child's quick rage, but like something older and deeper, something coiled. At night, he lay awake while others slept, staring at the rough ceiling above him, listening to the creak of wind-blown timbers and the distant howl of dogs in the hills. He dreamed not of battles, but of escape, of being seen and heard, and rising above the silence that clung to those without power. Already, the idea of greatness had begun to press itself into his thoughts, not as fantasy, but as necessity. When the opportunity came to leave the island, he went not with joy, but with purpose, and the ship that carried him to mainland France also carried a kind of quiet bitterness. At Brienne, the military academy where he arrived shivering and seasick, the boy was smaller than the others, darker too, and his accent marked him before he could even open his books. The children from noble families sneered at the way he spoke, the strange lilt in his voice, the stiffness of his clothes, the intensity in his stare. He was mocked for being poor, for being Corsican, for speaking French like a foreigner. But he said little in return. He learned instead to watch even more carefully. The cold of Brienne bit through his coat and into his bones, and yet in that cold he began to sharpen himself, not with swords, but with silence. He read voraciously, not just what was assigned, but everything he could find. Caesar, Alexander, Turenne, the campaigns of antiquity, and the maneuvers of more recent wars. History became his weapon, and through it he found the shape of ambition. At night, while the others slept, He studied the angles of fortresses and the geometry of artillery, tracing strategies in his mind like others might trace prayers. In the early quiet before dawn, he would rise and walk alone beneath the winter trees, memorizing the stillness of snow and the way silence could hold a kind of strength. He wrote letters home, filled with longing and frustration, but also with clarity. He told of his loneliness, of the ridicule, of the cold rooms and colder classmates. But he also spoke of future plans, of reforms he would make, of injustices he would correct, of battles he imagined himself leading. His pen was already a kind of sword, cutting through doubt with visions of purpose. His thoughts moved faster than his years allowed, and his teachers, some of them, began to notice the mind behind the brooding eyes and the clipped speech. There was no warmth in his friendships, because there were few friendships at all. He trusted almost no one. But there was strength in that solitude, a hardening that became habit, then armor. He learned to speak less, to listen more, to see angles others missed. Where others sought favor, he studied. Where others gossiped, he read. And though his name still drew mockery, he wore it now like a challenge, letting the sound of it echo in classrooms and corridors, imagining the day when it would be uttered with fear and respect. Corsica remained in him, not just as memory, but as rhythm. The way he walked, the way he held himself, the way he scanned a room with both caution and calculation, it was all shaped by the island's lessons. He had grown up in a place where alliances were fragile, and history was always close and now far from home. He carried that history like a compass always, pointing him away from obscurity and toward the uncertain horizon of greatness. He was not yet Napoleon the Conqueror, nor the first consul, nor the emperor. He was a boy, alone in a foreign land, with a heart full of fire and a head full of maps. But already the outlines of power were forming in his thoughts, like mountains slowly rising out of fog. He saw himself not as others saw him, but as something becoming, something vast and unfinished. He was not yet known to the world, but he would be. He had decided that already. And so, in the quiet snow of Brienne, with frost at the windows and books, clutched in cold fingers with a voice that still carried the sea winds of Ajaccio, the boy with the accent studied and waited and endured. The world had not yet listened, but it would. He wrote often, and he wrote alone. In the pale mornings before inspection, before the clang of boots on stone and the call to form lines beneath the gray sky, he would sit by the frost-bitten window with ink-stained fingers and aching shoulders, and write. The act itself became a kind of ritual, not a task nor a release, but a small ceremony of presence-proof that he still existed somewhere beyond the silence of Brienne's walls. With each letter, he stitched a thread back to Corsica, delicate and trembling, as if the ink might carry his warmth across the bitter miles. His handwriting was small, efficient, tightly pressed against the margins, as though he feared wasting even the paper. The lines often ran too close, words crowding each other like soldiers packed into formation, disciplined, obedient, and quiet. In the script, one could sense the boy's restraint, his need to conceal softness beneath sharpness, to make order from confusion. He would never say he was lonely. Instead, he would speak of the weather, of his studies, of the progress in mathematics, and the sternness of his instructors. But beneath these subjects, the letter always trembled with something unspoken, a private ache that language never fully captured. He wrote to his mother most of all, to Letizia, the figure that stood like a statue in his memory, fixed, unwavering, a fortress of devotion. He asked about her health, about the price of bread, about the chickens in the yard and the olive harvest. He reminded her to save money, to invest in his brother's futures, to be cautious of neighbors who whispered too easily. And yet, woven between those reminders and instructions, there was a gentle yearning that rose like mist. He asked how the sea looked from the window, if the house still smelled of rosemary, if the hills still sang with cicadas in the dry season. He did not ask for comfort, but he summoned it. To his brother Joseph, the tone shifted, less protective, more strategic. He urged Joseph to read, to improve his French, to study law, to plan. Their correspondence became a mirror of ambition, one brother reflecting the other's doubt and drive. Napoleon did not plead or praise. He persuaded. He argued. He wrote not like a boy to his elder, but like a mind already attuned to command, offering clarity where others might offer affection. Still, behind the precision of each paragraph, there was an unmistakable warmth, made more tender by the fact that it remained unspoken. When replies came, they were slow and often too brief for his liking. The handwriting would be Messier, the phrasing more colloquial, filled with references to people and places that were beginning to fade in his imagination. He read them over and over, long after the paper had softened at the folds. He did not seek news so much as reminders of a world that had once wrapped around him like a shawl and now existed only in ink and memory. Some nights, he would unfold old letters and read them by candlelight, tracing the curves of each sentence as though they might reach out and cradle him. He imagined the voice of his mother, the rhythm of the Corsican dialect slipping into her French, the way she might have dictated her words to someone else's hand, too busy or too weary to write herself. He imagined the way his sister's laugh would still echo through the hall, how the goats in the yard would bleat at dusk, how the shadows fell across the stone walls of the kitchen where he had once stolen bread. These recollections did not make him weak. They steeled him. They gave him direction. The absence of affection in his environment became an ember in his chest, glowing quietly, feeding a different kind of fire. He was not starved of love, not entirely, but the kind of love he required was not the kind offered in smiles and praise. He needed belief, conviction. He needed to be seen as someone becoming. And so, he cultivated that self on paper, building it line by line, so that his family, when reading, might sense the shape of the future more than the weight of the present. His letters were acts of transformation. Each one was a rehearsal, a draft of identity. In them, he was not merely reporting his life, he was reimagining it. A poor boy in a cold academy became a scholar. A foreigner became a citizen. A silent cadet became a thinker, a planner, a strategist. He used language like a blade, cutting through his own limitations, carving space for a vision few around him yet perceived. He did not waste time with decoration. His sentences moved with purpose, like marching feet. But now and then, in the gaps between thoughts, emotion leaked through like candle wax, slow and uninvited. A note of concern for his sister's cough. A sudden description of rain falling against his window pane. A memory of figs drying on cloth, of dust rising in the courtyard where he once played with Joseph. These details slipped in as though his heart had found a way past his mind's defenses. As he grew older, the content of his letters shifted. There were fewer questions, more declarations. He began to offer ideas, opinions on politics, reflections on war. He spoke of Rome and Sparta, of order and virtue, of duty and will. The letters became maps of his thought, and those who received them, his family, his teachers, an old friend in Ajaccio likely, did not understand all he meant. But he no longer wrote to be understood. He wrote to become inevitable. What he never wrote, never admitted, not even in the privacy of those sheets, was how deeply he missed the warmth of familiar voices. The smell of salt on the morning air, the sound of oil popping in a pan, the murmur of prayers before meals. Those memories clung to him in sleep. And even as he pushed them away by day, by night they returned to soften him. The dreamer is never as distant as he pretends. And so, each week, sometimes more, sometimes less, he sat with his pen and shaped a life that was both present and not yet arrived. He told stories of himself to those who loved him, so that when they finally saw him again, they would not see the child they remembered, but the figure he had described, harder, hungrier, brighter. He needed their memory of him to evolve as he evolved. Because love, in the end, was not just what they gave it, it was what he invited them to believe. The boy at Brienne wrote letters not only to be remembered, but to build a bridge between what was and what must be. He understood, even then, that distance was both curse and blessing. It hurt to be forgotten, but it helped to be alone. In the silence, he found voice. In the distance, direction. And when he sealed those envelopes, pressing his thumb into the wax, he was not merely ending a letter. He was marking a milestone, a step closer to something immense. Not yet emperor, not yet soldier, not even yet a man, but something already rising, quietly, word by word, sentence by sentence, from the solitude of ink and longing. He did not speak much, and when he did, the words seemed to come from a place far away measured, quiet, edged with thought. While the other boys wrestled in the snow or muttered about supper, he watched. He had the gaze of someone perpetually elsewhere, as if a second world existed behind his eyes, one of fortresses and rivers, of treaties and betrayals, of ideas that twisted and tightened like the gears of a watch. No one quite knew what he was thinking, but they all felt he was always thinking. In that silence, something was forming. Books were his true companions, not just for study, but for shelter. He read with a hunger that defied his years, as if each paragraph held some hidden cipher, a clue to break open the future. History, geography, philosophy, all were absorbed, processed, catalogued, but it was war that truly transfixed him. The shape of it, the rhythm of victory and retreat. He memorized the names of battles the way other boys memorized saints. Toulon, Marengo, Pharsalus, Austerlitz, though that one had not yet come, not on the page, only in his mind. He studied the ancients as one studies gods. Caesar, Hannibal, Alexander, they were not just men to him, but models, blueprints, prophecies. He traced their campaigns on maps with his finger, lingering at crossings and choke points, as if by touching them, he could taste the dust and blood of those fields. Sometimes he would draw new lines, imagine different outcomes, revise history. His notebooks filled with arrows, annotations, ideas. Not scribbles of fantasy, but calculations. Quiet rehearsals of domination. At night, after the lamps were extinguished and the hall fell to the breath of sleep, he would lie still, his eyes open to the dark. In his mind, whole regiments shifted into position. Hills became vantage points. Rivers posed problems. He would march imaginary armies across Europe in silence, assigning them purpose, predicting the enemy's weakness, adjusting his formations. The world shrank and expanded inside his head, becoming both smaller and more precise. A continent folding under the weight of thought. Others mistook his silence for arrogance. They did not know how heavy it was to carry so many visions without voice. He could not share them, because they would sound like madness or worse, presumption. What boy at Brienne spoke of empire without ridicule? So he stayed quiet and watched and read. And in that quiet, he built something vast. He saw France not as it was, but as it might be. Torn, yes, but waiting. Waiting for someone to gather its splinters into something sharp. Revolution was beginning to thrum beneath the surface, like thunder behind a mountain. He felt it, sensed the shift in the air, even before the world would crack open. The old order would crumble, and in the rubble, there would be room for someone like him, someone precise, someone cold enough to move pieces without trembling, someone who had already built the war in his head 1,000 times over. While the boys around him memorized Latin, he studied topography. Where others saw trees and slopes, he saw cover, elevation, line of sight. He noticed things. How wind moved across the courtyard, how sound echoed between the walls, how people hesitated at thresholds. He trained his mind to measure and anticipate. The art of war for him began not with weapons, but with perception. He was not a romantic. He did not dream of glory for its own sake. Glory, like power, was a means, not an end. What fascinated him was movement, how to move men, ideas, entire nations, from one condition to another. That was the real conquest. The ability to shift the story, to seize the moment and reshape it in the image of will. He believed in force, yes, but more than that, he believed in inevitability. Even in childhood, he felt older than the world around him, as if history had touched his shoulder and asked him to pay attention. And he did. He remembered dates, treaties, betrayals. He saw patterns, cycles. He noticed that every empire fell not from a single blow, but from erosion, slowness, indulgence, decay. And he promised himself, if he ever built something of his own, it would not rot from within. It would burn from the center. His notebooks became dens of obsession, pages filled with observations. How Caesar kept the loyalty of legions, how Frederick outmaneuvered larger forces, how Machiavelli defined fear and love. He was not interested in being liked. He was interested in being necessary. That difference, subtle yet vast, guided every mental blueprint he drew. And though no one saw them, those blueprints grew more detailed each year. He also studied failure. He collected examples of collapse, analyzed them with precision. What made men overreach? When did pride cloud judgment? What softened the edge of leadership? These questions mattered more to him than formulas or grammar. He did not want to pass exams. He wanted to avoid ruin. He did not want to shine. He wanted to survive. And somewhere in that cold academy, among the damp walls and the bitter air, a vision began to settle. It was not yet a plan, not quite, but it had form, shape, a silhouette on the horizon. A world not yet built, but already mapped. Not in ink, not on paper, but deep within him. A world organized by will, governed by clarity, expanded by fire. He would not rush toward it. He would wait, prepare, grow. His classmates mocked him for his accent, for his name, for his silences. But none of them saw the map. None of them knew how far ahead he was already marching. He bore their laughter like a cloak, uncomfortable, but useful. It kept him alert, made him sharper, reminded him that he would not be accepted, only feared or followed. And either path, he knew, would suffice. He began to walk differently, not with pride, but with precision, as if each step led somewhere specific. The cadence of command was not yet in his voice, but it lived in his gait, in the tilt of his head, in the way he looked not at people, but through them toward whatever lay beyond. Because even then, he was not only in Brienne. He was already standing on ridges unnamed, surveying valleys filled with smoke, issuing orders to men who did not yet exist. The map in his mind was alive, and it was growing. The scent of the sea was different now, sharper and heavier, mixed with smoke and the faint tang of burning wood, as if the very air of Corsica had been rewritten by conflict and loss. He had left the island as a boy, small and uncertain, wrapped in the warmth of family and tradition, but he returned not as a child, not even as a son, but as a stranger shaped by exile, ambition, and the cold discipline of the French army. The narrow streets of Ajaccio, once familiar and alive with the laughter of neighbors and the scent of roasting chestnuts, felt smaller, more brittle, as if they were memories cracking under the weight of revolution. Corsica itself had transformed during his absence, fractured by ideals and betrayals, torn between loyalty and rebellion. The islanders spoke with voices roughened by hardship and disillusionment, eyes haunted by battles both won and lost, and hearts burdened by dreams that seemed to slip further from reach each day. The land where he had learned to walk among olive trees and wild rosemary now echoed with the clash of competing flags and the bitter cries of divided families. The proud Corsican spirit he once cherished seemed overshadowed by suspicion and resentment toward those who wore the French uniform, himself included. His mother, Letizia, a pillar of fierce resolve and maternal pride, urged caution and endurance, but even she could not mask the shadow of exile that fell upon their household. Their name, once whispered with quiet honor, was now caught between whispers of loyalty and accusations of betrayal. The Bonapartes were neither fully embraced nor entirely rejected, and the boy who had carried their name into the military ranks now bore the heavier burden of navigating this tangled identity. He tried to bridge the gulf, to speak of unity and hope within the fractured island, but the words slipped through the cracks of old grievances and new alliances. The man he was becoming found little comfort in diplomacy. The island was aflame with unrest and rebellion, and loyalty shifted like sand beneath stormy skies. The legend of Pasquale Paoli, the Corsican patriot, was unraveling into fragments of disappointment and discord. And the boy who once revered Paoli's vision now saw the painful limitations of myth and memory. He understood that Corsica would never again be home in the way he had dreamed, that the ties of blood and soil could be severed as cleanly as any sword stroke. Amid this turmoil, he tasted the sharp edge of real command for the first time, not in classrooms or practice fields, but in the smoke and chaos of siege and artillery. His knowledge of strategy, once confined to pages and maps, became flesh and iron as he oversaw the placement of cannons, hauling heavy guns up impossible slopes with relentless determination. Each decision, each adjustment of artillery position was made with a precision that startled even seasoned officers. The thunder of the cannons shattered dawn's silence, echoing over the hills and piercing the stillness of a land at war with itself. Watching the town flinch beneath the barrage, he stood apart, hands clasped behind his back, eyes steady and cold, his face betraying no hint of triumph or sorrow. This was not victory nor defeat, but confirmation. The abstractions of study had become real, raw, and immediate. He was no longer a student of war, but a participant in its brutal dance. The roar of the guns, the recoil beneath his feet, the cries that followed, all were lessons etched into his skin and soul. Though the military success cleared the way for French control, it was a hollow victory. The island was lost to him in a deeper sense than geography. His family fled with him, clutching what little they could carry as they abandoned their home, their past, and their dreams of belonging. The cliffs of Ajaccio receded behind the ship's prow, shrinking beneath the horizon, swallowed by distance and the cold fog of exile. He did not wave goodbye. No tears marked the farewell. It was a severing, sharp, and absolute, a cord cut in the storm with no chance of reunion. France became his new world, not as a choice born of love, but as a necessity dictated by fate and resolve. Corsica's betrayal was an unspoken wound beneath his calm exterior. He cast off sentiment like an old coat and gave himself wholly to the Republic, not as a mere soldier, but as a mind ready to carve his place through intellect and strategy. The past was a landscape burned behind him. Ahead lay only the possibility of power and reinvention. Marseille welcomed them with its restless energy, a city pulsing with the fever of revolution, teetering on the edge of chaos and opportunity. He moved quietly through crowded streets and shadowed alleys, absorbing the noise and fear that swirled like smoke around the city's taverns and markets. Here, the revolution was not a distant idea, but a living, breathing force, unpredictable, ruthless, and intoxicating. It promised change and destruction in equal measure, and he watched it all with calculating eyes, searching for the openings it might offer. His proposals, ideas, and strategies initially went unnoticed or were dismissed by those caught in the whirlwind of upheaval. Yet fate turned when Toulon, a vital port city, fell into the hands of royalists aided by British fleets. The crisis demanded swift, decisive action, and the Republic looked for new talent. His name surfaced. A Corsican artillery officer, young and unknown, but marked by something more than rank. Given a chance to prove himself, he seized it not with arrogance, but with relentless precision and cold clarity. He repositioned artillery batteries, focusing fire not just on city walls, but on the very escape routes of the enemy, aiming to cut off their lifelines and strangle their retreat. The cannons roared with deadly intent, and the siege transformed from desperate defense to calculated offense. Toulon fell, and with its capture, the tides of his life turned irrevocably. He was no longer a shadow on the fringes, but a figure moving steadily toward the center of power. News of his victory rippled through Parisian salons and military circles. Murmurs became conversations. Conversations blossomed into recognition. But he did not chase fame or bask in acclaim. Instead, he measured it, folded it into plans and possibilities, treating reputation as another tool to be wielded with care. Public adoration was useful, but only when it served his purpose. The transformation was not merely external. Command, conflict, and the scent of blood had carved new edges in his character. The man who once dreamed quietly in the cold dormitories of Brienne now stood amid smoke and cannon fire, steady and unyielding. The lessons of leadership had been seared into him by fire, and he had learned to welcome the solitude it demanded. Corsica, once the pulse of his childhood, had faded into memory, distant and delicate, like a scar beneath his skin. Yet, in moments of silence, when the candle flickered low and the night pressed close, the image of the island returned. The cliffs standing stoic against the sky, the garden bathed in afternoon light, the gentle hum of cicadas. These fragments of home were both balm and ache, reminders of what had been lost and the cost of what was to come. He had shed one identity, only to assume another. The map in his mind, once cold and theoretical, now pulsed with possibility and fire. The pieces were moving, the world itself bending under the weight of his will. And though the path ahead remained shadowed and uncertain, he stepped forward with the certainty of a man who had already crossed too many thresholds to turn back. Paris was not merely a city. It was a living tempest, its veins coursing with fear, fervor, and restless energy that pulsed beneath every cobblestone and gas lamp. The air carried the mingled scents of burning timber and damp stone, of sweat-soaked crowds and crushed flowers left in hurried haste on cold doorsteps. Every corner, every shadow, held the echoes of footsteps quickening in suspicion, of whispered secrets barely held beneath the roar of revolution. It was here, amid this volatile crucible, that he stepped into a world unraveling and rebuilding all at once, a city on fire, both in flame and spirit. He arrived not as a conquering hero, but as an astute observer, absorbing the chaos with steady eyes, mapping the currents of power that twisted and surged beneath the noise. The revolution was no longer a distant idea. It had become flesh and blood, unpredictable and raw, like the wind that whipped through the narrow streets and rattled the shutters of ancient buildings. He moved carefully, as though each step might disturb a delicate balance, watching the faces of strangers who held both hope and hatred in their gaze. Paris was a city on the edge of madness, but within its frenzy, he sensed patterns, secret rhythms, and shifting tides that whispered of opportunity and dominance. The fateful days of 13 Vendémiaire broke like thunder. The royalists surged into the streets, their flags snapping against the gray sky, guns raised, and voices loud with the fury of rebellion. The city's defenders were scattered and uncertain, their courage brittle beneath the pressure of betrayal and fear. Into this chaos he stepped with the calm clarity of one who had rehearsed command countless times in silence, the weight of responsibility settling like armor around his shoulders. His voice cut through the panic with cold precision as he ordered artillery to sweep the streets with deadly fire, the cannons roaring like storms that silenced the insurrection and turned the tide back toward the fragile republic. This victory was more than a military maneuver. It was a declaration, a signal that a new force was rising amid the rubble of revolution. His name began to circulate beyond the barracks and war rooms, whispered in salons and cafes where the fate of France was debated over wine and candlelight. Yet he did not seek the adulation. Instead, he regarded his rising reputation as a tool, a weapon to be wielded with care and patience. Fame was not a prize, but a means to an end, a step on the path to something greater. Amid this turmoil, another current stirred, one more intimate, tender, and complicated. Josephine de Beauharnais entered his life like a fragile light piercing the storm. A widow of charm and resilience, her smile held both warmth and shadow, her presence a delicate reprieve from the harsh realities that surrounded them. Their connection was neither swift nor simple. It unfolded in quiet moments, stolen from the relentless tide of politics and war. In her laughter and whispered confidences, he found a sanctuary where the hard edges of his ambition softened just enough to reveal a glimpse of vulnerability. Their relationship was a dance of contrasts, public scrutiny and private refuge, passion and caution, love entwined with the ever-present dangers of the world they inhabited. Paris was a city of secrets, and theirs was one woven between the flickering candlelight of late-night dinners and the hurried footsteps through shadowed corridors. Josephine's touch was a balm, her voice a thread of warmth woven through the cold fabric of his existence. Yet beneath this tenderness lay the knowledge that love in such times was fragile, as easily broken as the fragile peace upon which the Republic rested. Meanwhile, the revolution's fury deepened, casting long shadows over the city. The terror descended with merciless force, turning neighbor against neighbor, friend into foe. Streets once filled with laughter now echoed with the silence of vanished lives, names scratched from lists, memories erased by fear and suspicion. He watched these purges with a calculating detachment, understanding that survival required more than bravery. It demanded ruthlessness, timing, and an unyielding will to command destiny rather than be consumed by it. Navigating the treacherous currents of Parisian politics, he forged alliances with care, choosing companions and enemies alike with an eye toward advantage and survival. Every handshake, every whispered conversation was a calculated move on a vast and invisible chessboard. He learned to read faces for hidden intentions, to weigh words against actions, to sense the ambitions that simmered beneath polite smiles and veiled threats. The game was no longer fought with muskets alone, but with minds sharpened by intrigue and the relentless pursuit of power. In this crucible of fire and fear, his vision of power crystallized into something clear and unyielding. Power was not the chaotic roar of revolution or the fleeting cheers of a crowd. It was discipline, order, control, the quiet mastery of movement beneath the apparent randomness of history. He began to see himself not merely as a soldier or lover, but as an architect of fate, a man destined to bend the course of nations with patience, strategy, and iron will. The nights in Paris stretched long and restless, filled with strategy meetings in dimly lit rooms, whispered counsel behind closed doors, and stolen moments of tenderness with Josephine. The Seine's dark waters reflected a city poised on the cusp of transformation, its lights flickering like fragile promises against the deep night. In those hours, his thoughts turned not to glory or conquest, but to certainty, the certainty born from knowing the path ahead, no matter how shadowed or perilous. His rise was steady, relentless. Each victory, each connection, each calculated risk built upon the last, weaving a tapestry of influence that reached from smoky taverns to the highest corridors of power. Paris in Flames was both his battlefield and his forge, shaping him into a leader who would command not only armies, but the very destiny of a continent. And so, amid terror, love, and ambition, the boy from Corsica stepped forward, no longer merely a player in history, but a force poised to write its next chapter. The dawn in northern Italy broke softly, the light filtering through mist that clung to rolling hills like a whispered secret, revealing landscapes both beautiful and fragile, where ancient vineyards stretched beneath skies heavy with promise. He arrived not as a conqueror, yet, but as a young general tasked with impossible odds, commanding an army battered by hunger, illness, and doubt. The men looked to him with a mixture of weariness and hope, sensing beneath his calm exterior a will that neither faltered nor wavered. It was here, amid these verdant valleys and shadowed mountain passes, that he would begin to shape his legend. Every step forward was a delicate balance between boldness and calculation, as he moved his forces through narrow passes and over rocky ridges, using terrain to his advantage, like a master painter wielding brushstrokes of strategy. He studied maps not as mere geography, but as living tapestries, where rivers became veins of supply and mountains rose as barriers to be circumnavigated or conquered. His mind mapped possibilities as others sought refuge from exhaustion. The campaign was not just a march, it was a dance of movement and misdirection, precision and surprise. Italy itself was a land torn between old regimes and new hopes, a mosaic of city-states and kingdoms, each with its own loyalties and grudges. He understood this fractured political landscape as deeply as the battlefields, exploiting rivalries with subtlety and timing. Diplomacy became another weapon in his arsenal, wielded alongside cannons and cavalry, as he forged alliances and sowed discord among enemy lines. His victories were not only won in battle, but in whispers, in secret negotiations held under the shadow of olive trees and moonlit balconies. The siege of Mantua loomed as a test of endurance and will. Months stretched into hardship, cold, hunger, disease tightening their grip on his troops like unseen chains. Yet his presence became a beacon, a steady flame amid encroaching darkness. He moved among his men with quiet resolve, listening to their fears, calming their doubts, reminding them of the purpose that bound them together. His voice, soft yet commanding, carried weight beyond rank. It was a voice of certainty in uncertain times. Each battle was a study in contrast moments of thunderous chaos, broken by eerie stillness, the clash of steel, and roar of muskets giving way to the haunting quiet of fields soaked in dusk and sacrifice. He watched the ebb and flow with eyes trained to see not only what was, but what could be. Retreats were not defeats, but carefully measured withdrawals, setting the stage for the next surge. Advances were not reckless charges, but calculated risks where every soldier's step was accounted for. The victories came, one after another, swift and decisive, like lightning striking across the Italian plains. His name spread beyond the borders of the Republic, whispered with a mix of awe and fear in the courts of Vienna and the palaces of Naples. He was a storm no one could ignore, a force reshaping the continent's destiny with every campaign. But beneath the triumphs lay the quiet cost countless lives lost, the weight of command pressing deeper with each decision that sent men into the jaws of death. In the solitude of his tent, away from the clamor of battle, he wrestled with the paradox of power, how to seize it without losing oneself, how to command without becoming cold and unfeeling. Letters from Josephine arrived like lifelines, fragile threads tying him to a world beyond war and ambition. Her words carried warmth and longing, a reminder of the tenderness he allowed himself only in fleeting moments. Their correspondence was a private refuge, a soft echo amid the harsh drum of cannons and marching boots. His strategies evolved, blending innovation with tradition. He employed rapid maneuvers, surprise attacks, and relentless pursuit, breaking the conventions of warfare in ways that stunned even his most seasoned adversaries. His troops moved with unprecedented speed and coordination, their morale buoyed by his confidence and vision. To his soldiers, he was not just a leader, but a symbol of promise that victory was within reach, even when the odds seemed impossible. As the campaign unfolded, the map in his mind expanded beyond Italy. He began to see the shape of an empire, a realm united not by lineage, but by force and law, where his vision could take root and flourish. The seeds of ambition were sown in every conquest, every treaty signed, every city brought under his sway. He was no longer merely a general of the Republic, but a man crafting a legacy that would echo through history. Yet beneath the grandeur lay shadows rivals watching, whispers of betrayal, the ever-present danger that success could be as fleeting as the morning mist. He guarded himself with vigilance, knowing that the same fires that forged him could also consume him. His path was one of solitude, marked by the burden of command and the sacrifices it demanded. The Italian campaign was more than a military venture. It was the crucible in which he transformed from a determined commander into a force destined to reshape Europe. Each victory carved his name deeper into the annals of history, but also into the hearts of those who would follow him or oppose him. As the sun set over the Apennines, casting long shadows over the land he had marched across, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The empire he dreamed of was still distant, a horizon waiting to be reached, but the first stones had been laid. The map in his mind was alive with possibilities, and he marched forward unyielding, unrelenting, and inexorably bound to the destiny he had chosen. The sea air hung thick with salt and anticipation as the fleet slipped away from the familiar coasts of France, waves lapping softly against weathered hulls beneath a sky heavy with clouds that mirrored the weight of unspoken ambitions. Egypt awaited a land of ancient mysteries and sunburned sands, where history itself seemed to seep from the very earth, and the wind carried whispers of forgotten gods and long-lost empires. He stepped onto this alien shore, the heat pressing against his skin like a living thing, the desert sun burning with relentless intensity, and beneath it all, a quiet pulse of excitement and unease stirred deep within him. This was no mere campaign. It was a voyage into legend, a crucible of glory and challenge intertwined. The Nile, a shimmering ribbon winding through endless dunes and scattered oases, was both lifeline and enigma. Its banks bore the marks of civilizations older than memory, where palm trees bent lazily in dry breezes, and the call of minarets echoed against ancient stone. For the soldiers wearied by months at sea and foreign landscapes, the land was a paradox, place of breathtaking beauty and unforgiving harshness. Where every grain of sand seemed to hold a story, every night sky stretched wide with unfamiliar constellations that beckoned with silent mysteries. Yet for him, the desert was more than terrain. It was a vast canvas on which to paint his destiny, a stage for the unfolding drama of power and conquest. Advancing into the interior, each day was a lesson in resilience. The scorching heat baked the earth and tested the limits of men and horses alike. Supply lines strained across shifting sands and barren wastelands, and the constant battle against thirst, fatigue, and disease was as relentless as any enemy musketeer's volley. Yet he moved with the steady purpose of a man who understood that victory belonged to those who could endure as much as those who could fight. His presence among the ranks was not distant or aloof. He walked beside his soldiers, listening to their fears, sharing their hardships, and inspiring them with quiet resolve. His leadership was not merely strategic, but deeply human, a bond forged in the crucible of shared adversity. The battle of the pyramids unfolded beneath the looming silhouettes of ancient monuments, their timeless presence a stark contrast to the chaos of muskets and sabers. The clash was thunderous, a symphony of gunfire and shouts, dust swirling into the blazing sun as formations surged and recoiled with fierce precision. His troops advanced with disciplined confidence, cutting through enemy lines with swift, decisive movements that shattered the opposition's resolve. The victory was resounding, yet tempered by the knowledge that beneath the triumph lay the complexity of governing a land, steeped in history and cultural depth, far beyond the reach of mere military conquest. Cairo, a city of winding streets and shadowed courtyards, became a world unto itself, melting pot where exotic scents of spices mingled with the smoke of conflict, where grandeur and poverty stood side by side beneath domes and minarets, reaching for endless skies. Navigating its labyrinthine alleys required more than force. It demanded diplomacy, cunning, and an understanding of traditions that stretched back through millennia. He moved through Cairo like a shadow, balancing the art of governance with the necessity of control, knowing that power here was as much about subtlety and patience as it was about cannon and sword. The desert nights were filled with a haunting silence, broken only by distant howls and the crackle of campfires, moments that forced him into reflection. Beneath a canopy of stars burning bright in the clear night sky, he grappled with the weight of ambition and the toll it exacted. The vastness of the sands mirrored the vastness of his dreams and the isolation that came with command. The desert was both a mirror and a challenge, reflecting his strengths and exposing his vulnerabilities, reminding him that every conquest carried a price paid in blood and sacrifice. His vision extended beyond immediate military gains. He sought not only to win battles, but to etch his name into the annals of history, to build an empire forged not only through force, but through lasting influence. The Egyptian expedition was a bold gamble, a stepping stone toward a future he envisioned with clarity and determination. Each decision rippled across the shifting sands, altering destinies in ways seen and unseen, while he balanced precariously on the edge between boldness and recklessness, aware that fortune favored the brave, but punished the foolhardy without mercy. The correspondence from Josephine was a fragile thread connecting him to tenderness and humanity amidst the harsh realities of desert warfare. Her letters, filled with warmth and longing, softened the harsh edges of his daily struggles and reminded him of a world beyond ambition and conquest. Her voice, though distant, was a constant presence, a quiet strength that fueled his perseverance during the long, relentless campaign. Yet the campaign was fraught with challenges beyond the battlefield. Tensions simmered among his generals. The scorching climate tested endurance, and supply lines stretched thin across unforgiving terrain. Despite these trials, his leadership remained steadfast and inspiring. He adapted European military tactics to fit the unique demands of desert warfare, blending innovation with audacity. His forces moved with unprecedented speed and coordination, their morale buoyed by his unshakable confidence and vision for victory. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, flickering shadows across the endless dunes, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The desert had revealed new dimensions of his character ambition, tempered by endurance, strategy softened by human frailty. The sands were unforgiving, yet they had shaped him, carving a legacy as shifting and enduring as the land itself. The dream of empire burned ever brighter within him, yet the desert's silent vastness was a constant reminder that true power was a fleeting, delicate balance. He would carry the desert within him, always its silence and its storms, etched into the very fabric of his being, a testament to the cost of greatness and the endless challenge of wielding power in a world that never stays still. Paris was still draped in the fragile remnants of revolution, the city's stones soaked with memories of upheaval, and the air heavy with uncertainty and cautious hope as the republic sought to stitch itself back together from years of chaos and bloodshed. The streets, once arenas of fierce battle and impassioned protest, now hummed with whispered negotiations, wary alliances, and the subtle dance of political survival. It was a city caught between the shadows of its violent past and the promise of a new order, and into this delicate, trembling balance stepped a man who was no longer merely a general, but a strategist whose vision extended far beyond the battlefield. The fall of the Directory was not marked by thunderous gunfire or grand spectacle, but by quiet, deliberate moves executed with the cold precision of a master tactician. The coup of 18 Brumaire unfolded with a careful choreography, faces familiar yet unreadable, footsteps measured, and words exchanged in shadows that carried the weight of irrevocable change. It was a coup not of brute force, but of subtlety, a calculated maneuver that shifted the axis of power without shattering the fragile framework of the republic entirely. The political landscape, fractured and volatile, was coaxed into a new shape, one that promised order, stability, and the centralization of authority. He navigated the corridors of power with the same careful calculation that had defined his military campaigns, understanding that true dominance was won as much by timing and diplomacy as by strength. His ascent to the role of first consul was both a consolidation of personal ambition and a strategic response to the nation's desperate craving for stability after years of turmoil. The consulate was more than a political regime. It was a rebirth of France, a delicate blend of republican ideals and authoritarian control that sought to harness the energies of revolution without succumbing to its chaos. Yet the consolidation of power was fraught with challenges. Opposition simmered beneath polite facades, and the wary press hovered like shadows, ready to pounce on any misstep. He engaged in a constant balancing act, projecting strength and decisiveness, while tempering it with gestures of conciliation and reform, designed to placate wary citizens and wary elites alike. Each speech, each decree, was crafted not merely to inform, but to inspire and reassure, weaving a narrative of renewal and progress that would bind the fractured nation together. The reforms he set in motion reached into every facet of French life, touching law, education, and the economy. The Napoleonic Code emerged as a monumental effort to unify and clarify the legal system, replacing chaos and inconsistency with order and predictability. Schools were reorganized to cultivate loyalty and competence among future generations, forging citizens attuned to the ideals of the new France. Economic measures sought to stabilize a nation battered by war and internal strife, rebuilding infrastructure and invigorating commerce. These were not mere policies, but the careful laying of foundation stones for a durable legacy. Paris itself became a living symbol of transformation. Grand boulevards sliced through the labyrinth of narrow streets, monumental buildings rose toward the sky, and public spaces blossomed into arenas of civic pride. The city breathed anew, a phoenix rising from ashes, yet beneath the surface, the whispers of dissent and unrest lingered. He understood that the peace was precarious, held together by the vigilance of a state that watched closely and acted decisively. Behind closed doors, the machinery of governance operated with relentless efficiency. Ministers and advisers, each chosen for loyalty and skill, formed the gears and cogs of an ever-turning engine powered by his vision. Yet at the center stood he himself, the architect and master of this grand design, whose will and intellect shaped the destiny of millions. His decisions were swift and unyielding, but informed by a deep understanding of the intricate web of political, social, and economic forces at play. The personal toll of this ascent was palpable. The weight of authority pressed heavily, and moments of solitude were often shadowed by reflections on the sacrifices demanded, not only of himself, but of those around him. Letters from Josephine, once a source of warmth and tenderness, grew infrequent amid the tides of political upheaval, and their relationship bore the strains of ambition and distance. Yet her memory lingered, a faint but steady light in the corridors of his mind, reminding him of the fragile humanity beneath the armor of power. Publicly, he embraced the role of leader with a keen sense of theater and symbolism. Ceremonies, speeches, and grand displays were woven into the fabric of governance, creating a narrative that fused republican virtue with imperial grandeur. He presented himself as both man of the people and sovereign authority, a balance that demanded constant negotiation and care. This image was crafted with an acute awareness that perception was as powerful as policy in shaping loyalty and legitimacy. The consolidation of power was not a final destination, but a foundation, a launching point for ambitions that stretched beyond France's borders and the fleeting peace of the consulate. It was the forging of a state rebuilt on the ashes of revolution, steadying itself under the weight of history and expectation. Every reform, every act of governance, every assertion of authority etched his mark deeper into the annals of time. Yet shadows of opposition never fully faded. Secret plots and whispered conspiracies lingered in the dark corners of salons and corridors of power, a reminder that dominance was always contested. He fortified himself with resolve and pragmatism, knowing that vigilance was the price of survival in the precarious world he now commanded. As the gas lamps cast their steady glow over the streets of Paris, illuminating both grandeur and grit, he stood poised at a threshold. No longer simply a military commander, he had become the master architect of a nation's rebirth. The rise of the consulate was not an end, but the dawn of an era, a foundation upon which he would build an empire that would echo through centuries. The morning of December 2nd, 1804, dawned over Paris with a quiet majesty, the sky painted in soft shades of gray and blue that seemed to hold the breath of a city on the cusp of transformation. Streets once worn by the footsteps of revolutionaries and soldiers now brimmed with anticipation as thousands gathered along the grand boulevards and public squares, their faces a mosaic of curiosity, hope, and trepidation. Flags fluttered gently in the cool morning breeze, their colors vibrant against the backdrop of historic buildings that bore witness to centuries of French glory and upheaval. The city itself seemed to pulse with the slow, steady rhythm and echo of the profound moment unfolding within the walls of Notre Dame Cathedral. Inside the cavernous sanctuary, the air was thick with incense and the murmur of voices woven into a tapestry of reverence and expectancy. The soaring Gothic arches and stained glass windows filtered the pale light, casting kaleidoscopic patterns upon marble floors worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The grandeur of the cathedral set a solemn stage for a ceremony charged with symbolism and ambition, where every detail, from the rich tapestries adorning the altar to the carefully choreographed movements of clergy and courtiers, was imbued with meaning. Here, history would bend and reshape itself, as a man whose rise had been forged in revolution and war prepared to claim a crown that would change France and Europe forever. He entered the cathedral with measured steps, his demeanor calm yet resolute, embodying a blend of humility and unshakable purpose. Draped in opulent robes embroidered with gold and symbols of power, he carried the weight of destiny upon his shoulders, each thread a reminder of battles won, sacrifices made, and the dreams of empire that had propelled him from the rugged shores of Corsica to the heart of a restless continent. His eyes scanned the assembled nobles, clergy, and dignitaries, not with arrogance, but with the steady gaze of a man who knew the cost of the crown he sought. As the service commenced, the interplay between church and state took center stage. The Pope, representing centuries of spiritual authority, approached with the crown, ready to perform the sacred rite that would legitimize the new emperor's reign. But in a move that stunned all in attendance, the man took the crown from the pontiff's hands and placed it upon his own head. This singular act was charged with profound meaning, a deliberate assertion that his authority derived not from divine sanction, but from his own merit and the will of the people. The cathedral fell into a hushed awe, the silence heavy with the weight of history being rewritten in that instant. This act of self-coronation embodied the paradox of his reign, a fusion of imperial ambition and revolutionary ideals, a leader who claimed sovereignty yet sought to position himself as the servant of the nation. The gesture sent ripples far beyond the walls of Notre Dame, signaling to monarchs and republics alike that a new kind of power had taken root, one unbound by tradition and defined by force of will. It was both a declaration and a challenge, setting the tone for the empire he intended to build. Throughout the long ceremony, layers of ceremony and symbolism unfold, a dance of vows, blessings, and oaths that fused religion, politics, and spectacle into a single narrative. Nobles knelt in deference, Clergy intoned prayers that echoed through vaulted ceilings, and the people watched with a mix of reverence, skepticism, and fascination. The city's heartbeat seemed to synchronize with the solemn cadences of the Mass, the ancient stones absorbing the moment when revolution and monarchy converged into something wholly new. Outside Notre Dame, the streets of Paris thronged with celebration and unease. Crowds filled squares and promenades, their cheers mingling with whispered concerns. The city was alive, caught between the ghosts of revolution and the promise of order. Bells tolled from distant towers, mingling with the clatter of carriages and the hum of conversations, debating what this new era might bring. The coronation was not merely a spectacle, but a profound turning point, a nexus where past and future collided beneath the gray Parisian sky. Behind the scenes, the political landscape was as intricate and fragile as ever. Rival factions observed cautiously, their loyalties uncertain, their ambitions veiled behind polite smiles and guarded words. Secret meetings, whispered plots, and the ever-present undercurrent of intrigue reminded all that power was a contested prize, not a gift freely given. Yet through it all, he remained unwavering, his focus fixed on the empire he sought to forge, a realm where law, culture, and military might would converge under his command. The personal cost of this moment was palpable. The crown, while a symbol of supreme authority, also bore the weight of solitude and sacrifice. Letters from Josephine, once a balm to his restless spirit, had become rarer as political demands mounted, and his life became an unrelenting march toward destiny. Yet even in moments of isolation, her memory offered a flicker of warmth, a tether to a world beyond power and ambition. As the ceremony drew to a close, he allowed himself a brief moment of reflection alone amidst the echoes of chanting and footsteps fading into the vast cathedral. The journey from Corsican youth to Emperor of the French had been marked by storm and struggle, but now he stood at the pinnacle of power. The crown was not merely an ornament, but a charge to lead, to build, and to face the challenges that an empire would inevitably bring. Outside, Paris exhaled, the city slowly returning to its rhythms, yet forever changed by the events of that day. The emperor's gaze turned outward to the borders he would defend, the peoples he would rule, and the legacy he would craft. The coronation was both an end and a beginning, a moment suspended between history and destiny, as a man who crowned himself prepared to shape the course of a continent. The vastness of Russia stretched before the advancing army like an endless frozen sea, its boundless plains and dense forests cloaked beneath a thick blanket of snow that glittered cold and indifferent beneath a pale, wintry sun. A biting chill crept relentlessly into bones and breath, turning every exhale into a mist that vanished into the unforgiving air. The landscape seemed silent and vast beyond comprehension, a daunting expanse that swallowed sounds and swallowed hopes alike, while the horizon wavered like a mirage in the frigid distance. For those who marched under his command, the Russian campaign was not only a test of military might, but a battle against nature itself, harsh, indifferent, and merciless. From the earliest days, the campaign was marked by hardship and uncertainty. Supply lines stretched thin across frozen lands where roads disappeared under drifts, and the bitter cold gnawed away at both men and horses. Rations dwindled, and illness spread quietly in the frost-bitten camps, a shadow as lethal as any enemy bullet. The soldiers trudged forward with weary determination, their faces gaunt, eyes hollow but resolute, bound by loyalty and the fragile hope that the vast wilderness would eventually yield to their will. The strategic brilliance that had carried him to glory in so many battles met its greatest adversary in the Russian winter. His plans, honed through years of conflict, faltered against a foe without mercy. The scorched earth tactics employed by the retreating Russian forces left the advancing army bereft of shelter and sustenance, their hopes slowly melting like ice beneath the weight of cold despair. The vast distances and brutal climate conspired to unravel even the most meticulous preparations. And the once mighty Grande Armée found itself fighting not only human foes, but the very elements. Amid the snow-covered forests and frozen rivers, battles raged with desperate ferocity, each engagement a brutal test of endurance and will. The fiery cannonades and clashing steel echoed faintly beneath the heavy silence of the winter landscape, a haunting contrast to the vast, icy stillness that enveloped the land. Every step forward was paid for in blood and suffering, and the glory that had once seemed so attainable now flickered like a distant candle struggling against the wind. The retreat from Moscow became a slow, harrowing ordeal, a march through relentless cold, starvation, and the ever-present threat of ambush. The city itself, a once proud symbol of conquest, lay in ruins, its burning streets casting flickering shadows against the night sky. The soldiers, once proud and numerous, dwindled into ragged survivors, their spirits tested by loss, exhaustion, and the cruel bite of frost. The Russian winter was no mere season, but a merciless force that shattered armies and dreams alike. He bore the burden of command with a stoic resolve, his mind a constant calculus of risk and necessity as he sought to salvage what remained of his forces and dignity. The weight of failure pressed heavily, yet he never wavered publicly, masking despair behind a mask of determination. In moments of solitude, beneath star-studded skies that offered no comfort from the cold, he grappled with the limits of ambition and the brutal realities of hubris. The campaign became a defining crucible, a test not only of military genius, but of human endurance and humility. It revealed the vulnerabilities beneath the armor of invincibility and marked the beginning of a slow unraveling of the empire he had built. Yet even in defeat, the lessons etched themselves deeply of overreach, resilience, and the relentless forces of nature that no strategy could fully conquer. As the survivors limped back across frozen plains, the silence of the winter was heavy with sorrow and reflection. The Russian campaign was a stark reminder that even the greatest empires are fragile, and that power, no matter how fiercely grasped, is always subject to the inexorable forces beyond human control. The fury of winter had humbled a conqueror and altered the course of history, its cold breath lingering long after the snow had melted. The island of Elba appeared on the horizon like a distant jewel, small and unassuming amid the vast expanse of the Mediterranean. Yet it became the stage for a profound chapter in the life of a man once master of Europe. The salty breeze carried a softness foreign to the thunder of battlefields and the clamor of courts, whispering instead of solitude and reflection. As he stepped onto the rugged shores, the sun warmed the rocky land, and the gentle lapping of waves created a quiet rhythm that contrasted starkly with the relentless march of ambition and war that had defined his years. Here, in this modest exile, the great emperor faced a silence heavier than any battlefield cannonade. Life on Elba was a world apart, a place where the grandeur of empire faded into the rhythms of nature and the simple tasks of governance over a small domain. The island's olive groves and vineyards stretched beneath hills that caught the golden light of dawn, and its villages hummed with the quiet activities of fishermen, farmers, and townsfolk, whose concerns were far removed from the politics and power struggles of distant capitals. Yet even in this exile, he carried with him the weight of his past glories and the restless fire of ambition, his mind never ceasing to plot and plan amid the serene landscape. The days unfolded with a slow cadence, marked by walks along sun-dappled paths and moments spent overlooking the sparkling sea that seemed to promise freedom even as it circled him like a barrier. The air was fragrant with herbs and salt, and the stars at night shone with a clarity that invited contemplation and solitude. It was a time for reckoning, a space carved out by fate for reflection on the cost of power and the fragility of human dreams. Away from the roar of cannon and the murmur of courts, the silence invited both peace and torment in equal measure. Yet exile was no surrender of spirit. The island's modest palace became a command post for schemes and correspondence that reached beyond its shores. Letters flew between allies and foes. Whispers of return and resurgence floated through European capitals, and the flame of his legend burned undiminished, even in his quiet retreat. He remained a figure of fascination and fear, his name carrying weight across the continent, and his mind was never idle, always calculating paths back to the stage where history was made. The solitude of Elba brought moments of vulnerability rarely seen by those who had witnessed only the commanding figure on the battlefield. There were times when the vast silence seemed to echo the emptiness left by lost power, and nights when memories of triumph and loss danced in the flickering candlelight. Yet beneath this quiet twilight, the embers of resolve smoldered, kindled by the knowledge that destiny was not yet finished with him. Surrounded by a small court and a loyal few, he navigated the paradox of being both captive and ruler, a man stripped of empire, yet still wearing the mantle of command. The island's limits confined his physical reach, but could not contain the vastness of his will or the depth of his dreams. He moved with measured grace, blending resignation with restless hope, embodying the complex human story behind the myth. As the days lengthened and the Mediterranean sun cast its warm glow over Elba's rugged cliffs, the world beyond watched and waited. The emperor in exile was no forgotten relic, but a force poised on the edge of return, a man whose story was far from over. The quiet of Elba was but a prelude to the storms that lay ahead, a moment suspended between fall and resurgence, silence and the roar of destiny. The silence of exile on Elba was abruptly shattered by the restless pulse of ambition that refused to be extinguished. Under the veil of night, with the Mediterranean winds whispering promises of return, he slipped away from the island shores, his heart pounding with the intoxicating blend of hope and defiance. The journey back to France was fraught with danger and uncertainty, yet each mile brought him closer to a destiny that awaited with bated breath. The landscape that unfolded as he landed was both familiar and changed, a nation weary of war, yet stirred by the legend of a man who dared to defy fate. As he marched through the countryside, the air was thick with anticipation and tension. The people, who had known only defeat and upheaval, found in his return a spark of old glory rekindled, a promise that the tides of fortune might yet turn. His charisma and reputation preceded him, and the soldiers stationed along the way faced a choice between loyalty to the fragile new order or allegiance to the returning emperor. One by one, battalions joined his cause, swelling his ranks with the fervor of hope and the desire for redemption. The 100 Days had begun a brief, electrifying resurgence that shook the foundations of Europe. Yet beneath the surge of optimism lay the stark reality of fractured alliances and looming threats. The European powers, alarmed by his audacity, quickly formed coalitions determined to halt the tide of his return. Armies amassed on distant borders, while political leaders scrambled to contain the unfolding crisis. The continent held its breath, poised on the knife's edge between renewal and ruin. He, undeterred, prepared to confront the challenges with the same strategic mind that had brought him from obscurity to empire. The battlefield of Waterloo emerged as the final stage for this dramatic confrontation, a patch of Belgian earth destined to bear the weight of history. The morning of June 18, 1815, broke under a leaden sky, the air thick with humidity and unease. Armies arrayed themselves across fields muddy from rain, their flags fluttering against the somber light, while commanders surveyed their forces with steely resolve. The clash that followed was brutal and unforgiving, a symphony of cannon fire, clashing steel, and desperate cries that echoed across the rolling hills. The battle unfolded hour by hour, each moment laden with tension and the precarious balance of chance and skill. His tactics were bold and relentless, his presence on the field a beacon of command and inspiration. Yet the weight of exhaustion and the combined might of his enemies pressed heavily. The arrival of fresh allied forces tipped the scales, unraveling the fragile hope that had carried his army through the opening hours. As the day waned, defeat became inevitable, the dreams of resurgence fading beneath the storm of cannon and cavalry. In the aftermath, the silence was profound, a heavy stillness that hung over the fields soaked with the blood of thousands. The echo of battle gave way to the quiet footsteps of retreat, the weary faces of survivors marked by loss and resignation. He, once the master of Europe's destiny, now faced the irrevocable decline, the final chapter of a saga writ large across continents. The weight of defeat was a burden carried with dignity, a solemn acknowledgment of limits unsurpassed. Yet even in this moment of downfall, the spirit that had driven him to greatness flickered with stubborn light. Plans of escape, hopes for exile, and dreams of legacy mingled with the harsh realities of his circumstances. The man who had crowned himself emperor now stood at the edge of oblivion, his story poised between the pages of history and legend. The 100 Days and the Battle of Waterloo marked not just the end of a reign, but the close of an era defined by ambition, brilliance, and tragedy. The fields of Belgium would forever bear witness to the final stand of a man whose impact shaped the course of nations and whose legacy would endure long beyond the echoes of muskets and the silence of defeat. The journey to St. Helena was long and somber, a voyage across vast, storm-tossed seas that seemed to echo the tumult of a fallen emperor's soul. The island, remote and rugged, rose like a silent sentinel from the South Atlantic Ocean, its cliffs stark against the endless horizon of blue and gray. Here, far from the courts of Europe and the echo of cannon fire, he would spend the remainder of his days, a solitary figure confined by geography, but not by thought. The winds that swept across the island carried both the salt of the ocean and the weight of reflection, inviting contemplation on a life marked by glory and loss. St. Helena was a place of isolation, its landscape wild and untamed, a stark contrast to the grand palaces and battlefields that had once defined his existence. The rocky terrain and windswept plains became the backdrop for a slow unfolding of inner journeys, where memories mingled with regrets, and the mind wandered through the vast corridors of a storied past. Days passed with a quiet monotony, punctuated by long walks along rugged paths and moments spent gazing at the endless sea, the vastness a mirror to the expanse of time and legacy. In exile, stripped of armies and crowns, he turned inward. His reflections were a tapestry woven with triumphs and mistakes, conquests and sacrifices, ambitions fulfilled and dreams shattered. Letters to friends and family became lifelines to a world now distant, while dictated memoirs sought to shape the narrative of his life and reign. The solitude allowed a clarity impossible amid the clamor of power, revealing the complexity of a man who had been both hero and tyrant, liberator and oppressor. Yet the isolation was tempered by moments of human connection, loyal companions, a few trusted aides who shared his confinement and bore witness to the quieter sides of a man often seen only in the blaze of battle and command. Conversations in the fading light of day, shared meals, and the simple rituals of daily life offered small comforts against the vast loneliness of exile. These moments, though fleeting, illuminated the humanity beneath the myth, the vulnerability behind the legend. St. Helena also became a crucible for legacy. The emperor was keenly aware that history would judge him not only by victories, but by defeats, by the dreams he dared to dream, and the costs they exacted. He labored to shape the story told by future generations, an epic of courage, reform, and the indelible mark left on Europe's landscape. His writings sought to immortalize a vision of leadership and destiny, a testament to a life lived at the limits of possibility. Outside the island, the world continued to turn. Empires rose and fell, and the echoes of his era reverberated through politics, art, and culture. His exile became a symbol of the rise and fall inherent in human endeavor, a cautionary tale and a source of fascination. Scholars and storytellers debated his place in history, while the memory of his campaigns inspired both admiration and controversy. The man in exile was both diminished and magnified, his story growing in complexity as time passed. The island's sunsets, casting long shadows over rocky cliffs and restless seas, marked the passage of days in quiet succession. Each dusk invited reflection on the ephemeral nature of power and the enduring spirit that defined him. Though confined in body, his thoughts roamed freely, traversing the vast terrains of memory and hope. St. Helena was both a prison and a sanctuary, a place where a man confronted the full measure of his life. As the years wore on, the boundary between legend and reality blurred, the solitary figure on the island becoming a symbol larger than himself, a testament to the heights of ambition and the depths of human frailty. The exile's days were marked by contemplation and an unyielding will to be remembered, not just as a conqueror, but as a man who sought to shape his world. The room was dim, lit by the soft flicker of a single lamp and the hush of the evening wind pressing against the stone walls. It was May 5, 1821, on the remote island of St. Helena, and the once mighty emperor lay quiet beneath heavy blankets, his breath shallow, his eyes half closed, wandering now through memories no one else could see. Outside, the sea whispered endlessly to the cliffs, and the garden trees trembled with the island's ever-present breeze. The silence of those final hours held the weight of a life that had thundered through Europe, shaping borders, lives, and futures, now reduced to the stillness of one last breath. Those close to him, doctors, aides, companions, stood nearby in hushed vigil, their faces etched with exhaustion and reverence. He had spoken less in the final days, drifting in and out of consciousness, revisiting France in his dreams, walking once more through the halls of Versailles or riding across the fields of Austerlitz, under skies that no longer remembered him. His mind, ever restless, returned to battles won and lost, to cities that had once echoed his name in triumph, to the eyes of Josephine, to the hands of his son, to the vast, complex story of a man who had tried to shape the world and had been, in turn, reshaped by it. When the final moment came, it was not with thunder, nor with the fanfare that had marked his coronation or his battles, but with a breath so faint it could have passed unnoticed, a whisper to the sea. The emperor was gone. In that instant, time seemed to slow within the room, as if history itself had paused to take note of the passing of one of its most restless architects. There was no cannon fire, no cheering crowd, only the slow rustling of wind in the garden, and the quiet grief of those who had followed him to the end of the earth. He was buried on the island, beneath the shade of weeping willows, in a valley wrapped in silence. The grave bore no name, by his own request. The stone above it did not boast of his titles, nor did it declare his legacy. It remained blank, a gesture of humility or defiance, depending on who recalled it. Yet even in death, the idea of Napoleon did not lie still. It stirred in the minds of those who had known him and those who only knew the stories. The myth was already forming. In Paris, in Vienna, in London, and beyond, people whispered of the man who had risen from obscurity to reshape an empire. They debated his genius, his ambition, his cruelty, his brilliance. Some called him a monster, others a visionary. Artists painted him cloaked in romantic shadows. Writers turned his life into parable and poetry. Soldiers remembered the timbre of his voice on frosted mornings before battle. Mothers named sons after him. Rebels quoted his words. Monarchs feared his return even in death. Over time, the man became a symbol of possibility, of hubris, of change. His life was retold in marble and bronze, in songs and silence. He was a cautionary tale and a legend, a ghost that lingered in the corridors of European power. In exile, he had sought to write his own story. In death, the world took up the pen. Each generation reimagined him, projected into his silhouette their own hopes and terrors, their questions about authority, freedom, ambition, and downfall. And yet, beyond the myth, there remains something quieter, more human. A man who once wrote love letters by candlelight, who held his newborn son with trembling hands, who stood alone on a cold deck, watching the horizon slip further from France. A man who made mistakes, who mourned, who aged, who dreamed. In his final breath was not only the end of an empire, but the quiet echo of all that it meant to live so fully and fall so far. St. Helena still remembers. The grave remains, tended by time and wind, a small place for a man who once ruled continents. And as dusk settles over that lonely island, it is easy to imagine the emperor walking once more through the gardens, the sound of his footsteps softened by moss and mist, his thoughts drifting through history like smoke rising into an indigo sky. Time moved forward, as it always does, brushing dust across the centuries, softening sharp names and reshaping legends in the warm hands of memory. Yet some figures remain lodged deep in the collective imagination, returning not as ghosts, but as silhouettes etched into culture, power, and thought. Napoleon Bonaparte, soldier, emperor, exile, did not simply vanish into the folds of history. He lingered, transformed, translated, mythologized, his presence never fully departing from the stage he once dominated. His name continued to echo, not only in textbooks and battle maps, but in art, in law, in fashion, in language, and in the subtle architecture of modern statehood. In France, the soil he once trod bloomed with contradictions. Statues rose in plazas where revolution had once burned. Streets bore his name, schools taught his campaigns, and young men dreamed of glory wrapped in his shadow. Yet there was also discomfort, the uneasy reckoning with the blood spilled in his name, the republics crushed beneath his boot, the liberties traded for grandeur. In every century that followed, France looked toward Napoleon not with a singular gaze, but with a prism of feeling pride, regret, admiration, criticism, curiosity. He was claimed and rejected, revered and revised. He belonged both to the marble halls of the past and to the murmuring conscience of the present. Across the world, his reflection took on new shapes. In South America, Bolivar found inspiration in Napoleon's assertion that history could be bent by will. In Germany, poets and philosophers measured the emperor's rise against the tides of spirit and fate. In the United States, he was studied in military academies and whispered about in political theory. In Russia, he haunted the pages of Tolstoy, a figure too vast to be contained by one perspective alone. And in quiet libraries and busy classrooms, he continued to spark debates. Was he a tyrant or a visionary, a liberator or a conqueror, a product of his time or a force that shaped it? Even in popular culture, he persisted painted on canvases, portrayed in films, parodied in cartoons, quoted in boardrooms, invoked in headlines. His face, with its sharp features and intense gaze, became a symbol as recognizable as any crown. The bicorn hat, the hand tucked into his coat, the icy stare across a battlefield, these images became part of a visual language the world still understood. Children learned his name long before they learned the nuance of his deeds. Adults returned to him with new questions, wondering what drove a man to such heights and how far the human will could reach before it collapsed under its own weight. But beyond the symbols and scholarly debates, there remains a quieter legacy one that lies not in power, but in the tremble of human ambition. Napoleon's life reminds us of the fragility behind greatness, the solitude hidden beneath command, the burden of shaping the world. His rise speaks of the hunger for transformation, and his fall whispers of limits, of mortality, of time catching up with even the most relentless of men. He is remembered because he dared so much, and because his story contains both the arc of triumph and the inevitability of dusk. And still today, when we stand beneath the dome of Les Invalides in Paris, gazing down at his tomb, we are not only looking into the silence of one man's end, we are looking into a mirror. In that chamber of stone and light, where footsteps echo and the air hangs heavy with reverence, we confront the enduring question: what is it that draws us to such lives, again and again? Is it the scale of their deeds, or the reminder that no empire, no matter how vast, can outlast time? Perhaps it is both. Perhaps we are drawn to Napoleon not only because he shaped history, but because in doing so, he revealed the cost of such shaping: the solitude, the obsession, the brief, brilliant flare before the quiet. In the end, all that remains is the story, told and retold, softened by generations, carried like a candle through corridors of thought. And in that light, flickering gently against the walls of memory, Napoleon walks still not as emperor or exile, but as a question we continue to ask softly across the ages. The world beyond your window has grown quiet, folded gently into night. Perhaps a candle flickers near you, or perhaps it is only the hush of your breath that warms the silence. In this stillness, Napoleon recedes once more, not as a conqueror, not as a name etched in marble, but as a shadow across memory, soft and far away, like a figure glimpsed through gauze. We have walked with him, not through battles and borders alone, but through gardens and corridors, through letters unsent, and silences never broken. We have felt the weight of his crown, the loneliness of command, the ice of exile. We have touched, with care, the fabric of a life that burned so fiercely it could not help but leave traces on everything it passed. Now the footsteps fade, and only the hush remains. History does not end, it exhales. And in that breath, slow and warm and wandering, we are left with something deeper than fact or fame. We are left with the quiet shape of a life and the echo of a question. What remains when glory fades? What endures when the world no longer looks your way? Perhaps only this: a name whispered in the soft hours before sleep, a story told with reverence and rest, a voice remembering not just what was done, but how it felt to live through it, to carry the dreams and defeats of one soul across time, to see, in the flicker of another life, something of our own. So let your body sink into stillness now, and let the breath of the past drift through you like a warm wind across a cold plain. The emperor is asleep, the war horses rest, the flags lie folded, the snow falls quietly on distant islands, and in the hush you are safe, held by time, carried by story. Thank you for traveling with me tonight, for listening, for wondering, for remembering. If this voice brought you calm, let it return to you when you need it. There will always be another story, another soul, another candle lit in the dark. Good night, and may the echoes of history soothe your dreams.